Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Valley Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Joan Taylor, and today's topic is based on a contribution to a book she edited titled "The Body in Biblical, Christian, and Jewish Text." The link to purchase the book in the description below, and also in the pinned comment as well. The contribution in the book that I'm specifically referring to is called 2 by 2: The Archetypal Language of Mark's Apostolic Pairings. And with that being said, it's good to have you back on the show, Joan.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me.
Okay.
So I'd like to start us off with who is this hidden female companion of Paul?
Well, actually, the article that about the hidden female companion of Paul is actually in another book. I should say it's not in the body book. It's that one is the article I wrote for the body book is particularly about the 12, the apostles sent out by Jesus, as possibly having female companions. Because in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus sends out the 12 named men, they are sent out 2 by 2. And in that article, I argue that that particular terminology of being sent out 2 by 2 recalls what is said in Genesis about the ark, that the animals go in 2 by 2. And it has a link with the idea of male-female pairs being necessary to conserve them for the world. And in fact, we find that language quite distinctively of male-female pairings. So it's not just in pairs. There's other language that you could have used to refer to the apostles going out in pairs. So actually, when I talk about Paul's female companion elsewhere, I talk about this model really of there being male-female pairs going out on missionary activities that was already established by Jesus. And it's reflected in what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where he talks about himself and Barnabas having the right to a sister wife. And that he says, well, you know, the other male apostles and the brothers of the Lord have a sister wife. And it's quite clear that he is making this appeal to the community saying, look, you know, I have the right to eat and drink. I have the right to be supported by the community. I have the right to have a sister wife with me, supporting me, who is also supported by the community. It's all about his appeal. And he just makes this as a sort of blanket statement that all of the other guys, like himself and Barnabas, have this as part of what they do in their missionary work. So that linked up with what I had already explored in terms of Jesus sending out the apostles 2 by 2, made me wonder then about what we've got in terms of the this particular anonymous person who just turns up in the Acts of the Apostles as a character who's within this umbrella term we. You know, we go here and we go there, and we includes someone and Paul and sometimes others, but is not identified. So this kind of pattern of having these allusions to women who are associated with these male missionaries, but who don't get identified, I think is something we need to be alert to when we read our texts.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to say real quick is the reason I mentioned the body, your book, your contribution to the body is, I remember that you do talk a little bit about the Paul's hidden companion and your contribution. You talked about it a little bit.
Yeah,
Um,
I use that
in
as a
fact,
yeah.
it's from there, I believe that's where I first heard about your idea.
Mm.
Before I found out more about it. Um, so that's what happened there, just to give some
No worries.
clarification. Um, um, so what is the we document of Acts?
Mhm. So that there's lots of theories about why really in the latter part of Acts suddenly you get this shift. So you trundle along and everything is in the third person. The author, um, after a brief prologue at the very beginning, where the author does refer to I, that the
Mm-hmm.
author is referring to themselves. I don't know, male or female, in terms of the of an identity, but doesn't say who they are. Writing for Theophilus, who clearly does know who the author is. Um, the rest of it trundles on through chapter 1 through to chapter 15, just talking about events, talking about Peter and Paul and other characters in the third person. Then suddenly we get a switch in Act 16, and talking about Paul and Silas, and then th- there's we do this, we do that, and it comes through for a little section, and then switches back to they did this, they did that, and then we comes in again, and then they, and then we, and it goes all the way through, and there's quite a long section at the end, the sea voyage of Paul, where we are talked about. So that person is on the sea voyage and involved in the shipwreck in Malta, and goes on to Rome with Paul, but is not identified. There's just a companion of Paul. And what's striking is that person is never arrested when Paul is arrested, but seems to feel an obligation to be with Paul all the time. So, particularly on the sea voyage, that person is a companion of Paul going to Rome after he's released in Caesarea, after being in prison in Caesarea, in Palestine and Judea, and then just takes it for granted that they should be with Paul all the way to Rome. So so various things struck me as befitting a woman in that particular position. So in the article, which is titled "Paul's Significant Other" in the Wee Passages, I talk about this figure just simply as W, W for we and
Mm.
W for woman, unnamed, and just I try and trace through and pick out what's happening in terms of the various incidents and who the characters are and who is aligned with W at any given point. But if I call W the we character, maybe that's easier. The we character disappears and appears and is simply not the subject of the story. The subject of the story is very, very much in the latter part of Acts Paul. Paul is the hero. So the we character is not interested in themselves in any way. No feelings, nothing. It's not of interest. The only interest is in Paul and telling the story of Paul. And it's almost assumed that Theophilus doesn't need that information. This is just the author of the work with the prologue and this whole description of Paul's life and journeys. Um, and there it is. It's all about Paul, unless there's some interesting, quirky information about, whether the ship was, features of the ship, or whether they went on the left or the right side of Crete, or that there's little details, but nothing personal.
Who is this person called Thecla?
So yes, so in the article, after suggesting that this we character might very well be a woman, who is linked up with the prologue, I think about, I don't go through all the possible candidates of female companions or co-workers that Paul had, but clearly he had co-workers, and they are acknowledged. If we look at the end of the letter to the Romans in chapter 16, there's lots of women in that chapter who are acknowledged as doing important things, and there are male-female pairs acknowledged at the end of Romans as well. The one who isn't actually in the New Testament, whose name doesn't get recorded in the New Testament, which is in itself kind of interesting, but who is extremely esteemed in terms of Christian tradition, early Christian tradition, as being associated with Paul, is this woman called Thecla. And what happens in early Christian tradition is there are really important bits and pieces of information that has been transmitted over the centuries that are foundational in terms of memories of the saints, or of memories of historical characters from the first century that don't get recorded in the New Testament. And you can think about, we know nothing from the New Testament about the death of Peter. He just disappears from Acts. We have nothing in the New Testament about him going to Rome and founding or being involved in the Church of Rome and being executed in Rome. But we know this from early Christian tradition. Likewise, we don't have anything about the death of James, but we know this from early Christian tradition. So early Christian tradition can be very important in supplying information that simply wasn't recorded in the New Testament, recorded in Acts or any of the letters of Paul. And it didn't get included in the canonical collection of the New Testament because it was just told orally. It's what people knew. At the time the New Testament was being copied, the books of the New Testament were being copied and circulated. But it's very important. So I would say that the traditions about Thecla, the early stories told about Thecla, need to be looked at carefully and thought of as really indicating a woman who was involved in Paul's mission in the first century.
Does the We document contain parallels to the Acts of Paul and Thecla?
The We document does contain interesting parallels, because what happens with the so-called We passages, which, one shouldn't just think in terms of those little narrow passages where there are, the We comes in, the We character comes in. I think there's a whole great swathe of material that is written by one person in which the We character appears and disappears, like other characters appear and disappear in the act. So it's a big chunk with some inserts here and there. running from, it's hard to say exactly where it starts, but somewhere in Acts 15, it's certainly there, and goes all the way through to the end of Acts. So where it overlaps is in terms of its geographical situation. So one of the things about Thecla is she comes from the city called Iconium in Asia Minor, which is not very well. It's sort of Pisidia. It's quite central to Paul's activities in the first and second journeys of Paul, and actually that's where the we appears in Act 16. It's in that area that we appears in Paul's second journey. So it's like this. It's not said, "Oh, we were joined by this young woman from Iconium." I actually think that it's a little bit bitty at that point in Act 16. It's as if something has been jumped over, cut out, and we get this journey where the we character joins Paul and Silas, and they go on to Philippi. But that would fit in quite well with what we're told in the Acts of Paul and Thecla in terms of Thecla joining Paul for a time.
So was Thecla Paul's wife?
Well, that passage in 1 Corinthians 9, where it talks about a sister wife, you think the sister Adelphi, Christian believer, Christian, disciple of Jesus, one of the other people in the church, like Adelphos, Christian brother. Gune means either woman or wife. So as aner can mean either male person, man, or husband. And what I argue is there is a role for a gune, a woman, who is classified in terms of wifely duties in the ancient world. So what is said in terms of 1 Corinthians 9 is Paul says, don't we have the right to lead a woman? And that is, in the terminology of the ancient world, the language of having a wife. A man leads a wife. It was considered that was the language. When you get married, you lead a wife as a man. That's the terminology. So then the woman is classified as a wife. And that meant certain duties in terms of the relationship between the husband and the wife, the man and the wife, in that a woman was expected to look after a man, to do the washing and the cleaning and the cooking, the real traditional stuff. Of course, in the ancient world, that also meant having babies. But what we know from the early church, and Paul is a big exemplar of that, is that they configured celibacy as actually an ideal state. So in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says, I want everyone to be like me, which is actually celibate. So you've got this weird paradoxical thing where on the one hand, he's talking about the right to have a wife, Barnabas and himself having a wife. And on the other hand, he's saying, I wish you would all be like me, but if you can't, it's better to marry formally than to burn, So Paul is both celibate and yet says, don't I have the right to have a sister wife? So what I would say with that is it needs to be understood in the light of this early Christian practice that goes all the way through to the 4th century of having these celibate relationships that are configured as marriage, configured in some way as marriage, but are actually not consummated. They're not what we would understand as marriage. And in the 4th century, the studies have been done on this practice of the early church as a thing. In the 4th century, it was incredibly frowned upon because, people like Jerome thought it attracted criticism from the world outside. People wouldn't believe that there was celibate unions, that it was just considered naughty, immoral by society's standards. So it went out of favor. But certainly there was a lot of it in terms of the early church, this emphasis on celibacy as the ideal state, but also this relationship of men and women where men were expected, the reciprocal relationship was that men were expected to look after and guard women. So it was a way of single women being preserved as virgins, which was a highly esteemed state in the early church for women to be virgins. But they would have a male guardian, which was absolutely necessary for a woman in terms of her legal status. Anything that you did in terms of law, you had to, as a woman, have a male guardian. So, and we see that in all sorts of legal documents.
So can you tell us specifically about the role of women and leadership in Paul's day and how this relates to Thecla and how her role fits into the situation?
Okay, so 1 Corinthians 9, when Paul is talking about having a sister wife, there is this traditional thing about what a wife would do. Everything was very gendered in the ancient world. Men had responsibilities, women had responsibilities in a relationship. There was particular work for men and for women. But when it came to the mission, putting the message of Jesus out into the world, the role of transmitting that message could be held by anyone. And so we see that with Prisca and Aquila, how Priscilla and Aquila in Acts, they educate Apollos from Alexandria, who was a very educated man from Alexandria. But Priscilla and Aquila together as a couple are teaching Apollos the right way. And I think that pattern of both men and women working together as partners in mission is really important. So my book with Helen Bond, Women Remembered, was all about the hidden role, really, of women in the early church, the hidden role of women as leaders, because in the paradoxical world of Jesus' teaching, those who serve in the church are also the leaders. So you do very menial things like waiting on tables, like the deacons do in Acts. But this is actually a leadership role. So everything that looks like it's a menial role, whether it's, serving a husband or serving a church, is actually a leadership role in this back to front way of configuring hierarchy in Jesus' worldview. So it's really curious when it comes to the case of women who are already society has configured women much more in the serving role. So how do you present them as leaders when they are serving as leaders? So when it comes to Thecla's relationship with Paul, she is a disciple of Paul. She is joining Paul on his mission, but she is also a leader in her own right. And early Christian tradition would remember Thecla as a leader in her own right.
So, do you think that Thecla wrote the we document of Acts? And also, a second part to that question: do you ascribe Thecla as the author of Luke Acts as well, or only the we document?
Well, it's an interesting thing, because if the prologue then links up with the we passages, and the we passages are part of this larger second part of Acts, which is distinctive in terms of its Greek language. It's more refined than the first part of Acts in terms of Greek. The style switches. So as you switch over to talking more about Paul, the style of Acts does shift, and the style is more similar to the prologue. But the prologue is very much referring back to the preface of the Gospel of Luke, which is more expansive and saying, many have already composed accounts, Theophilus, most excellent Theophilus, so I will too write this account so that you will be convinced of everything. If that's then also the same author, then it means that some version of Luke was written by the same character, this we character. And that then connects with this issue that is much debated in terms of the Gospel of Marcion, the Gospel that Marcion used in the 2nd century, because as some of your listeners will know, that Marcion was considered a problem in the Roman Church in around 140. He came from Pontus, he came from Asia Minor to Rome, sort of late 130s, around 140. And he argued that the church should do away with the Jewish scriptures. The Jewish scriptures were not important for the church. He based himself on Paul. He said Paul's message was the most important of all of the early Christian teachers, and this was the appropriate one for Gentiles. And if you followed Paul, you shouldn't actually still have Jewish scripture, which would have been the Septuagint as read in Rome, the Greek version of Jewish scripture. And he said, instead of the traditional Jewish writings, there just needed to be one gospel, which he said his followers should read, and a collection of Paul's letters. So there was one gospel called the Evangelion, and a collection of Paul's letters called the Apostolicon. And he said, that is our scriptures. These are Christian scriptures. You don't need Jewish scriptures. And he was rather critical of the idea of the Jewish God being one that was not really the Christian God. The Jewish God and the Christian God were different in terms of their character. So what later writers said about Marcion is that he had perverted in some way the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke that they knew was not the gospel of Marcion, and therefore it was Marcion that had chopped up the gospel of Luke. But scholars, John Knox, Joseph Tice, and others, they argue differently and say, actually, what these later writers like Tertullian or others were saying was, what their evidence is that there was this gospel used by Marcion, but there's no reason to think that Marcion chopped it up. It's more likely that our Gospel of Luke was a reaction to what Marcion's Gospel was all about. And our Gospel of Luke is a more developed version of the Gospel used by Marcion. So what I would like to explore, and I haven't explored it properly yet in terms of any writing, is, how much could we say that the gospel as used by Marcion was the original gospel of this we character? And Tertullian says, well, Marcion doesn't attribute it to anybody, it's anonymous. Why does he not attribute it to anyone? Well, it was very common in antiquity up until very modern times for authorship by a woman to be anonymized, because it was considered immodest. It was considered not so authoritative. Authorship by a woman was not a good thing, either in the ancient world or in quite the modern world. I am. It's something that I want to explore a lot more, actually, and really go in and dig down into all the things that people say about Marcion's gospel. And of course, there's lots and lots of people who've written about Marcion's gospel, and I know that one has to be very careful. Matthias Klinghardt has done an interesting reconstruction of Marcion's gospel as something preceding the Gospel of Luke. Marcus Vincent has even suggested that Marcion's gospel was the first gospel ever written. But I don't particularly subscribe to that, because I think if we link it with the prologue, the preface of the Gospel of Luke, it clearly indicates there were other people who had written before this gospel was written.
So, assuming that Marcion's gospel isn't abridging Luke, you're suggesting that a possibility could be that Thecla wrote the gospel that came into Marcion's possession and also the we document, but not Luke Acts as we have it.
No, not the final version of Luke Acts. So there's this idea that I really subscribe to among textual scholars. David Parker, writing about the development of the text of the New Testament, that in the early period of the church, when these writings were circulated, they were essentially living texts, which means just as you might give a speech and somebody would then retell your speech and add a little bit to it or subtract a few things from it, so also writings could be added to or subtracted from as they were circulated around different Christian communities. And that was the period in which, our Gospels are written, the letters of Paul are read out, copied, circulated, shared in different ways. And in that very creative, energized phase of the church, they were also expecting the end times very soon. So they weren't thinking so much in terms of preserving the authentic voice of an author for posterity. They were thinking about what was going to be useful for them here and now. And as time goes on, there's a settling in of the church into the world. In fact, in our version of Luke Acts, that you can see that settling in taking place. Already by the end of the 1st century, you can get the sense in First Clement and other works that there is more of a settling in, even though that they're still thinking of the end times coming reasonably soon. And that continues on till the 4th century, when there's a serious settling in the world, with the Roman Emperor Constantine taking over matters of the church. So in that very creative early period of the formation of our Gospels, the Gospel of John is going through different editions, and that's been well examined by many commentators on the Gospel of John, thinking about how our version of the Gospel of John has come to be. And likewise with Luke Acts, it's at the end result of a period of authorship, of it's not editing so much, it's sort of creative retelling of scribal activity, and it goes off in possibly different directions. With the Gospel of Marcion, that I should say the Gospel Marcion used, it might very well be Marcion's community was redacting what was an original gospel. So in some ways it could be a little bit what later Christian writers are saying about Marcion, that he chopped and changed things. Because I wouldn't want to say that Marcion's gospel was exactly the authentic version, certainly not as Matthias Klinghack has reconstructed it. It might well be chopped about for Marcion's sake. But what I would say is there was something that was a kind of original Gospel of Luke, and the second part of Acts, which fits in with a sort of narrative that supports the letters of Paul, or narrative that supports an apostolicon, in fact, used by Marcion. And that would make sense. Now, what would be wonderful is if someone uncovered an ancient tomb and opened a jar and found such a document. But what we as historians, I'm a historian, can do is simply make a case, and it's certainly not something that we can prove, but it would make some sense given what we've got as Luke Acts.
And what would your take on Marcion's version of Paul's letters be in light of all this? Because they're, as you know, they're a shorter version. They're much shorter than our canonical text.
Yeah, there's no record exactly of the texts of Paul's letters that Marcion used, these 10 letters. And it includes a letter to the Laodiceans. What on earth happened to the letter to the Laodiceans used by Marcion? But he hugely valued Paul. For Marcion, Paul was the preeminent speaker and guide in terms of how Christians should live their lives, as I said. So to have some kind of narrative that supported what the letters were all about, as the second part of Acts does, would make sense. However, there's no mention of such a narrative. There's only mention of, by people like Tertullian and others, that Marcion had this chopped up gospel that he didn't attribute to anybody, but they don't say anything about Acts.
And in my final question, when would you say that Thecla wrote this material?
Well, one of the things I find quite interesting in the Thecla tradition is that there was at least by the 7th century, a tomb of Thecla attested in Rome. And in a revision of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, it said that she's buried in Rome. So if she is the wee character that ends up in Rome at the end of the Acts of the Apostles with Paul, and she's buried in Rome, she would be writing sometime after Paul arrives in Rome. If Paul is killed as a result of the persecutions connected with the fire of Rome, so we've got his death as 64. If it's connected with the fire of Rome, then we have Thecla writing sometime before that, so in the early 60s. The reason I say that is because there's no description of Paul's death in the Acts of the Apostles. So I think it could very well be that she wrote before he died. Though the other way of thinking about it is that she wrote not wanting to talk about the death of Paul as something too tragic, and she lived some time after Paul and wrote any decade up until the end of the 1st century, really, depending on how long we think that she lived. So I don't know. I wouldn't like to say, but sometime in the 1st century, the latter 1st century.
So do you think that Thecla used in whatever this original version of Luke Acts looked like, is she using Mark as a source or some version of Mark, or is she not using Mark?
Absolutely. She's using Mark as a source. So when I say she wrote something at the end of the 60s, I'm thinking about that particular material where she's talking about, Paul, and actually writing that as an initial thing for that section of the Acts of the Apostles, that latter part of the Acts of the Apostles. So that would be the first thing that would be written as a memory of Paul, and then it would get absorbed into this larger work that I also think was written by Thecla, and as part of that work, she had the first part, the Gospel of Luke, as we know it, but I think not with chapters 1 and 2. I detach 1 and 2, the nativity account of Luke, as something separate that was woven in at a later time. It's got a different style. It jumped from the beginning of Luke, that first little bit, through to the historical positioning of John the Baptist in chapter 3. So I would put, I'm giving you all these details about what I think actually happened. That the original Gospel of Luke would be from chapter 3 onwards, but not exactly as we have our version of the Gospel of Luke, because I think that our Gospel of Luke has been really redacted.
Well, all right. Can you remind the audience real quick what your article is called and what you talk about Thecla extensively?
Yes, it's Paul's significant other in the wee passages, and it's chapter 7 of a book. So the full citation for my article, where I talk about the wee passages, is Paul's significant other in the wee passages, and it's in Craig Evans and Aaron White's edited volume, Who Created Christianity? Fresh Approaches to the Relationship Between Paul and Jesus. It's published by Hendrickson in 2020.
And I'll have a link to purchase the book in the description below in the pinned comment, including to the Body in Biblical, Christian, and Jewish Texts, if you want to read her contribution to that as well, on her contribution titled 2 by 2. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Joan Taylor.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's rather a complicated topic, but I hope it's introduced people to some of the problems of reading these texts.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.